we have a captivating talk. I know that because I just finished the book this morning. And this book, called President Garfield, From Radical to Unifier, details the life of President Garfield through his military time, through his extraordinary work in Congress, and his unfortunately all too short time in the presidency. The book follows Garfield's journey from an impoverished boy, working his way from the frontier, serving as a progressive statesman, trying to raise a more righteous, peaceful republic out of the ashes of the Civil War. The tragically imperfect course of that reformation. A lot about the man himself and his family, and the back and forth of what public life does to a family. A man whose death succeeded in nudging the country maybe back toward a little bit calmer, a little bit cleaner politics for at least a moment. We were very excited when Charlie Goodyear, the author of this book, came to us. He's a New Orleans native, but has been a bit all over the world. He moved between Australia and the United Kingdom while growing up, before returning to the United States to attend Yale University, graduating with a degree in global affairs, not surprising since he had been all over the globe, moved to the Washington, D.C. area, where he now lives in Alexandria, Virginia. This is his first solo book, although he previously co-authored a book called One Mission with a former naval officer. So that was when he did some work as a ghostwriter, and now he's straight up right here telling a story, a biography that captured him, and he put to paper something that would capture all of us. So, Charlie, welcome. We're delighted to turn the mic over to Charlie Goodyear. Tell us about President Garfield.
Thank you, Jane. That might be the most generous introduction I've yet received for any of these book talks since I began selling this book on July 4th of this year. July 4th, by the way, being a good date to release a biography of an otherwise not known president. Yeah, and this has been a long, circuitous journey, but it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you, and as well as the Capitol Historical Society, because this book, which started as from an authorial perspective, I began writing and researching this about 4 to 5 years ago. It really centers very much on the history of the U.S. Capitol and some of the most crucial moments in the history of Congress. So I just want to extend to Jane, as well as the entire audience here today, how grateful I am to be here with you. So the first question that I've been asked from when the research on this book began, through the writing process, and then finally, now that we're out on the book tour, is why James Garfield? Of all of the presidents in our pantheon of executive leaders in this nation's history, why would you pick James Garfield of all people? And that's not a question that the biographers of Washington or Lincoln or Jefferson, or these more prominent presidents, that their biographers never need to answer something like that. Why this subject? But for James Garfield, it is a pertinent one. And I think actually you're the perfect audience for me to make this case too, because as you'll see here, if I can make my transition there, James Garfield's story is really in great part a story about Congress in the 19th century. If you walk thoroughly through the Capitol on this day, you'll find that James Garfield is one of the very few figures who has not one, but two statues on Capitol Hill. You have on the left hand there, the Garfield statue on the southwest corner of the Capitol building. And then on the right, you have his statue, which is an entry in Statuary Hall. He is one of Ohio's two entries into that collection. And then on the top right, you have just another reflection of how much James Garfield's career is really a story of Congress in particular. This is an article, A Century of Congress, that minority leader James Garfield was asked to write during a very inauspicious occasion, which this was during the disputed presidential election of 1876, the greatest constitutional crisis in the history of our nation to that point. So I'm putting this all here right now to show with what great relief it is that I'm addressing, the Capitol Historical Society, because his relevance to all audiences should never be more clear than it is to this crowd right now. But the story of James Garfield and what really drew me to him, he wasn't the figure I was looking for. About 5 years ago, as Jane mentioned in her introduction, I was a ghostwriter working in the DC area. And as a product of where I was geographically, and I think where we all were as a nation and still are, sadly, politically, I was very interested in finding a period of American history where the conditions of division seem to be overriding every aspect of our nation's being, from its economy to its politics to its society to even the basics of racial relations. So I wanted to find a period like that in our past as a researcher, and I wanted to find a figure who was leading the nation on a national level in a way that was defying the spirit of that times, defying that divisive spirit. So I was drawn to Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, which is that terrific, legislatively fascinating and sadly very opaque and obscure post-Civil War and then post-Civil War period of our history. And so I was doing my research on that time. And then throughout that period, I found pretty much in the background of almost every single major event, from economic crises to pitched legislative battles to constitutional crises like the disputed election of 1876, I found the same figure lurking in the background of almost every single major event. And that person was, spoiler alert, James Garfield. And whenever he would appear in these histories, his legacy, whenever he appeared on stage during these critical scenes of our past, his legacy would be distilled into a single sentence. Historians would write of him when he appeared: James Garfield, future president, would be assassinated within his first year in office. But then the closer I got to the man, and the closer I got to the terrific details of his life, because there is no greater story than a life. That's the whole creed of biography is devoted to, exploring the arc of human existence in a single life. The less fair it seemed that somebody who had accomplished so much would be remembered not for how they lived and not for how they led during their life, but rather how it ended. And there's nothing better, as you can see right here. There's that terrific side profile of James Garfield on the right. But on the left, we have a quote from Garfield's predecessor in the White House, speaking of James Garfield, before James Garfield was even elected to the presidency. This was a quote that came right after James Garfield's nomination for the presidency. And it's Rutherford Hayes saying of Garfield, "The truth is, no man ever started so low that accomplished so much in all of our history. Not Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln, even." So the finer details of this are, astounding, and they're honestly very hard to fit within a 45-minute talk, let alone a 2-hour one. And believe me, I've tried over the course of, doing the book tour for this work. But the basic contours of this incredible life are this. James Garfield was born in 1831 in a log cabin in what was then the frontier of the nation, the Western Reserve of Ohio, which was and still is oxymoronically the northeastern part of the state. Garfield was born to a poor homesteading family. He lost his father when he was about 2 years old. James Garfield was raised by a single mother. And as a matter of fact, he was not even the first James Garfield in his family. He was named in the New England tradition after an elder sibling who had died before he was born. So as I've now said on the book tour, James Garfield was born to what I'd estimate to be, this didn't appear in the book, but this is in my judgment. He was born to probably the lowest rung of American society that a white Northern man could be born into. But then you fast forward, you jump forward to his late 20s, so younger than I am now. And he was a state senator, a college president, and an abolitionist preacher, a very prominent abolitionist preacher in his region, all at the same time. And then you fast forward another year and change, and he is, as you can see in that beautiful portrait on the right, he is the youngest brigadier general of that time, youngest general of that time in the Union Army during the Civil War. And then you fast forward another year and change, and he is all of a sudden, he is, by his counting, technically the youngest congressman in the nation. He was technically wrong on that. There was an at-large member from Oregon who he didn't count in that personal metric, but we'll give him some grace there. And then what follows from 1863 right up until 1881, when James Garfield assumes the presidency, is a congressional career that today measures out as, in length, unexceptional. James Garfield won 9 consecutive House terms. Today, we're spoiled by people who go to Washington from their constituencies and then never leave. But by that period, that point in American history, James Garfield's congressional tenure measures out as almost a record breaker. And as a matter of fact, he remains, first, the only American to ever be directly elected from the House to the presidency, but also the only person ever to ever be a House member, a senator-elect, and a president-elect all at the same time. And over that 17 years, but from the mid-Civil War until 1881, so Civil War right through the Gilded Age, James Garfield becomes this incredible, this distinguished workhorse, this somebody who becomes key to keeping the gears of our government churning in a time of increasing polarization, increasing civil disorder, and constitutional stress. And I'll get into more of that in a moment. But right now, what you have before you, these are some of the things that I found during my research. These are the extracurricular activities that Congressman James Garfield got up to. He was a very prolific writer. And you see on the left here, he wrote articles for outlets like the North American Review and the Atlantic on a variety of things, the topic stretching from, on the top left right there, you see him arguing, I'll assure you, in this case, in the affirmative, against counterargument, that it was not a mistake to extend the elective franchise to Black Americans. On the bottom left, you see him writing another Atlantic article about one of those great dry details of public policy that everybody else found boring, but was in fact incredibly important, which is the history of the American currency and the future of fiat money. So money off of a metal standard in America. And on the right, before I get into that, actually, I'll also say that James Garfield, while he was serving in Congress, he was also practicing as an attorney before the Supreme Court. He won several cases before the Supreme Court. And as a matter of fact, the first case he ever represented as a lawyer and that he ever won was in front of the Supreme Court. And that was the case Ex parte Milligan, which is a big deal. And on the right, though, you see another one of these extracurricular activities of his. In his free time, James Garfield discovered and authored an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. So he, and on top of this, I'm also going to throw in here, because all these things just keep on coming to mind when you give these presentations, he also founded the first ever federal Department of Education as a congressman. So his achievements, he measures out as just an American Renaissance man. And not only a Renaissance man, somebody whose life, even before the presidency, seemed to be a fulfillment of the American dream. So let me just flash back to talk about my experience as somebody who was in DC and who was writing. When I'm piecing all of this together, I feel jealous, I feel lazy, and I feel intrigued that somebody who had accomplished clearly so much, again, when he seemed to be remembered in our nation's history, it only seemed to be, again, for this awful, awful ending to it, perhaps the worst way a president has ever gone. So that's where my story began, and that's where my writing began, and in many ways, that's where I'd argued my life began. Because as anybody out there who's written a book will tell you, when a good subject takes hold of you, all things pale in comparison. So, but the most important thing, and this is the thing that I think distinguished him the most, is that James Garfield became famous or infamous in DC by the end of his career. He didn't know it yet, but that he was the rare person who was able to overcome the increasing political polarization of the time. He was somebody for whom politics and ideology were these impersonal concerns, in that politics and differences in politics and dogma should not be an obstacle to enjoying your fellow American and treating them as a friend. And this is a quote from actually one of the most influential people in the history of Cornell University. This is Andrew Dixon White. And this is him talking years later about a conversation he had by a fireside with James Garfield. And here it goes. One of the most interesting things of this academic's life was this conversation with James Garfield, minority leader of the House by that point, because of his fair and even kindly estimates of men who differed from him. And White goes on to say, this is a refreshing change from most politicians who seem to regard their personal enemies as the enemies of the human race. So this was a core trait of Garfield's, and it's one of the key things that sucked me in. So again, distilling a life like that into a short talk is impossible. So instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you portraits of two different James Garfields. And the first is the one that we see in the Civil War. On the left here, these are documents that I found in his papers at the Library of Congress. And let me just read them out loud to you. The war has now fully begun. I am glad we are defeated at Sumter. It will rouse the people. I can see no possible end to the war till the South is subjugated. I hope we will never stop short of complete subjugation. Now, James Garfield was, at the start of the Civil War, he was a radical Republican. He was, for lack of a better term, to the left of Lincoln. He believed that the Civil War, and he welcomed it clearly, as you can see in this writing that he's saying right at the beginning of the conflict. He viewed it as an opportunity to cleanse America of its original sin, which was, of all things, in the view of the radical Republicans, racial inequity in the Republic. The radical Republicans were ones who did not want to stop short of the immediate abolition of slavery, which was something that, as you all know, Lincoln himself was slow to fully attempt to implement. But the radical Republicans believed in the absolute necessity of immediate equality of race before the law, in the ballot box. The radical Republicans, once the war really got started, they believed that leading Confederates needed to be exiled, executed, or permanently disenfranchised. They even believed that the great Southern plantations needed to be broken up and distributed among who they called loyal whites and former slaves. The radicals believed that the Civil War was not this interregnum. It was not this interruption of the history of our republic. It was instead, as others have elaborated, it was a second American Revolution, really, in the views of the radicals. And Garfield was from this region of Ohio that was militantly abolitionist in purpose, and he embraced that vision right from the very beginning. And he envisioned a long and sanguinary war, and his motivation in joining the Union Army as a volunteer officer was to be part of that crusading force to go deep into the South and to destroy this corrupt institution that should have never been there in the first place. So Garfield ends up becoming very frustrated by his experiences down south. He starts to see that his fellow army officers are not prosecuting the rebellion as aggressively as he thinks they should. He sees Union Army officers being forbidden, actually, from liberating slaves in areas that they conquer. There's this awful anecdote that Garfield writes home about during his campaigns in Alabama. He writes of seeing slaves come running to his column from the fields, from their plantations. And he writes of seeing another officer ordering his men to turn these slaves away at bayonet point, because that was not how the Union Army was being allowed to wage this war at this time. It was respecting Southern property rights. And property, of course, per the definition in that area at that time, including humanity. So Garfield was terribly torn up about this by halfway through the war. And he writes this line. He says, I'm losing great opportunities for growth. And he foresees down south, and these are his words, he foresees that there will spring out of this war a host of new questions and new dangers, the settlement of which will be more important than the winning of the war itself. And he's talking, of course, about Reconstruction. He foresees that the peace, winning the peace, whatever follows the conflict, will be more important than the war itself. So he flags to his friends, as he writes in this is from a letter that he wrote to his friends back in Ohio. He writes that he would be better served in Congress trying to win that conflict, Reconstruction, ahead of time, rather than continuing to serve in the army. And this photo you see right here, this collage, I should say, this was used for the cover of the book. And very interestingly, it shows, as it'll say in the subtitle of this image, it shows both General Garfield and /on Garfield, so because he's both a general and technically a congressman elect at the same time. So he makes that transition effectively. And then July 4th, 1865, the first Independence Day after the end of the Civil War, effectively. Garfield doesn't use this occasion when he goes home to Medina, Ohio, or to his home constituency. He doesn't use this to declare victory for his constituency. He instead warns them. He instead uses it as an opportunity to say, this conflict is not done. What is freedom? Have we achieved freedom? No. Is it the bare privilege of not being chained, of not being bought or sold, branded or scourged? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion. And it may well be questioned whether slavery were not better. He is warning his constituents about giving up the fight and, not prosecuting the Civil War for what it was really about in its aftermath. And then at the height of this speech, he actually passes out from heat stroke. And as a writer, you need to use that opportunity to change scenes. So this is where, in the book, when he passes out at the top of the speech, I use it for his transition into his congressional period, the period where he's involved in Reconstruction. So that's where that section ends. And then we flash forward. All of us right now will flash forward. And we'll flash forward about, let's just say, 17 years. And all of a sudden, James Garfield is not this young radical iconoclast. He is not somebody who is making scenes in the House. And he's not somebody who is arguing that the Constitution can be disregarded in matters of law when the will of the people demand it. He is instead the minority leader of the House. He is by far the most legislatively experienced left on the Republican side of the aisle. And he's changed. He's changed dramatically. This quote you see here, this is something that he said during the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, yet another event that James Garfield was on the front lines to. And it explains his changing mind about the nature of politics. He writes, based off of the performance of other radicals who are trying to impeach Johnson, Garfield writes home, I am trying to be a radical and not a fool. He is somebody who has come to accept that politics in America is the art of the possible. And he really has ridden the tides like no other Republican of his time. And as a result, I'd argue he is the only statesman, the only Republican statesman, surely, who on a national level participated in both the rise and then the fall of Reconstruction. And his character has changed too. These are good examples of the kinds of men James Garfield has to work around by the Hayes administration when Garfield is minority leader of the House. The Republican Party is badly factionalized, and the two main factions, the stalwarts and the half-breeds, are run by these two men. The stalwarts being run by Roscoe Conkling, you see there on the left. And on the right, you see James Blaine, who leads the other faction, the half-breeds. And for the entirety of the Hayes administration, you saw the Republican Party, after the fall of Reconstruction, really come apart into all these different different blocks. And they are the epitome of dysfunction, and they are the epitome of just personal vanity. And the only person who is able to bypass these factions and still overcome the divides of faction is minority leader James Garfield. He is described universally by all of these critics as being somebody who has no moral backbone. That's a phrase that almost every single other Republican, from Ulysses Grant to Frederick Douglass, to all these independent reformist Republicans who want to just clean up government and get rid of these factions. They all say the same thing about Garfield, which is that he lacks moral backbone, but he would turn this around. He would say being ideologically flexible, being friendly with your foes, overcoming divisions of faction. He would describe that as a source of great strength. There's this quote of his, it must be so easy to be a man of extremes. It is incredibly painful to see so many sides to every subject. And that really encapsulates his legislative philosophy and how he works with all of these egotists that he's sharing the party with. So you fast forward to the spring of 1880, and the Republican Party is so terribly divided. All these different factions have their own candidates for president. And it's clear to independent observers that none of these declared candidates ahead of the convention have the ability to overcome the divides in the party and then win in the fall, win in the general election. So independent observers are looking around and they're seeing only one person, it seems, who can really hope to be this candidate who can bring the party back together and then win in the general election, and that is James Garfield. And so they privately come to him again ahead of the nominating convention of 1880, and they give this pitch to James Garfield, and he is terrified by the prospect of running for president. He had seen it as really just, he'd been through so many presidential administrations by that point, and they'd all ended disappointingly for their incumbents in a variety of ways. He saw remaining in Congress, and now he wanted to switch to the Senate, actually. He saw remaining in Congress as the way to actually be a productive statesman. The presidency was this post that egotists who didn't want to be useful to the public would run for. So Garfield shooed these people away, but as this audience knows better than most audience, there is no such thing as somebody in Washington who is not interested in the presidency. It's not a binary scale. It's not 0 to 1. There's always some percentile of a politician's soul who is interested in the subject. So James Garfield, what does he do? He goes to the nominating convention as the floor manager for another candidate, John Sherman. And you see, look at this. This is an image of the convention floor. And look at that arena. Look at what a wonderful gladiatorial scene of political combat that is. James Garfield is in that crowd. And throughout the week-long nominating contest, he happens to, just so often, he happens to be in the right place at the right time, saying the right thing to all these different factions. And I don't want to go into the details, but he manages to present himself in the back of all these delegates' minds as somebody to consider if deadlock occurs. And deadlock does occur. And then suddenly, after dozens and dozens of locked ballots between all these factions, suddenly 20 votes, or maybe it was actually 16 votes at first, go to James Garfield from the Wisconsin delegation. And at this, he stands up. He stands up in that hall and he declares to the chair of the convention, you know, Mr. Chairman, point of order, no candidate can be voted on without their consent. You see, you know, which is an interesting point of view procedurally, but also if you want to be a cynic about it, that is the perfect thing for somebody to say in a deadlocked convention to convince everybody that they are the reluctant prince who deserves the role. And so Garfield is shouted down. The chairman goes, Chairman George Hoare says, the gentleman is not raising a point of order, sit down, and on the next ballot, bam, it all swings to James Garfield. He is suddenly and half regrettably the next Republican nominee for the presidency. Now, the seeds of his doom are seeded right there, because James Garfield's immediate problem, and this is true throughout the rest of his campaign to follow, is he needs to keep the Republican Party together, and the biggest challenge is Roscoe Conkling's faction, the Stalwarts. The Stalwarts were ruthless practitioners of machine politics. They were, for their enemies called them the corruptionists. And they believed in the monetization and the abuse of political power as being a necessary part of politics in general. So they liked taking control of public jobs because there were no civil service regulations, or very few of them back then. And they believed in using those to enrich themselves, to rig elections, to stay in power and win for the Republican Party by creating machines on the national level. And one of the worst machinists, one of the most notorious, was this man right here, Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur had been one of the leading stalwarts, and he had last been he had never been elected to a role. His job, he was the customs collector for the Port of New York for a while, which for a while allowed him to take a personal cut of whatever taxes or fees were imposed on imports coming into Manhattan, the biggest port on the continent. So he was this notoriously, corrupt figure. But in order to keep the stalwarts on his side, James Garfield decides, I need to give the vice presidency to a stalwart. I'll give it to Chester Arthur. And Chester Arthur is honestly flattered. And he goes to his leader, Roscoe Conkling, that man I showed you before, and he ends up deciding to take the role. And so here the story really falls apart. Garfield makes this deal. He promises stalwarts a variety of control of various public federal departments. And then the election is won, and things start to go predictably, because all of these different factions, they all start to try to get their claws into Garfield, and they try to convince him to give them more of the spoils, more of these public jobs. And you see the two different guys I showed you before, Conkling on the left, Blaine on the right. These are what they were telling Garfield about each other, and then what they were expected and entitled to after helping him win the presidency. Conkling is threatening Garfield. Conkling is adding, your administration, it's in my hands. I control the Senate. If you don't give me my share of the loot, this all falls apart. And Blaine had gone the opposite way. He tried to cozy up to James Garfield. So he writes here, you need to cut the stalwart throats with a feather. So the knives are coming out. And so I'd argue the administration proceeds predictably and then unpredictably in very quick order. It goes predictably because there is a falling out with the stalwarts. Conkling and the stalwarts, they fight with James Garfield. They have a dispute over who's getting which jobs. And Garfield ends up winning that fight. He ends up ousting the stalwarts accidentally from power. And then, and this is the scene that I'm showing you right here, it proceeds unpredictably, because you have a young, mentally ill stalwart decide that if he shoots James Garfield, that if he kills Garfield, then the stalwarts would be so grateful, because Vice President Chester Arthur would now be president, that stalwart President Arthur, would give the assassin whatever role in government the assassin wanted. So Garfield is shot in downtown DC in the Baltimore Potomac train station. And he doesn't die of the gunshot, as most of you probably know. He dies of an awful infection that just runs its course over about 80 days. It's an awful way to go. And the details that came up, these are some of the reports of his physicians. And their understanding of medicine was, let's just say, imperfect. They were subscribers to this old idea that pus and infections were the cause of internal fluid imbalances rather than exterior microbes. That idea was just gaining traction. And so you see on that note I have right there on the right, July 17, 7 p.m., a few lines down, or a few lines from the end, there is now a free discharge of healthy pus. That's because these doctors, again, per their traditional view of medicine, pus was a sign of healthy healing. It was one of the fluids of the body that were associated with recovery. And so healthy pus was not, it's an oxymoron to us, to them, not so much. So they were sending out these very nice, these very rosy reports for a long time. And it gets pretty disgusting. I'll just say on the bottom left there, you'll see in that paragraph, he's basically opening up on the inside. What is initially a bullet hole, it becomes a cavity because they're probing inside and they're seeding infection in there. Anyway, don't want to get too much into that. So James Garfield dies. This is a scene that I won't go into, but maybe we'll get into it in Q&A. But at the peak of his illness, he writes this message to his mom, because his mom, the woman who raised him back then, she is still alive. He actually moved her into the White House, but he's writing here from his sickbed, telling her to dismiss the conflicting reports and to assure her that everything's going to be okay. but of course it's not. So he dies. He dies on the New Jersey seashore, of all things. And these are, Jane mentioned at the beginning of this that she just finished the book. The closing section of my book, the epilogue, it talks about two great monuments to James Garfield that were built about the same time after his death. On the top, you see the official Garfield Mausoleum in Lakeview Cemetery, just outside Cleveland. And it is, as you can see, it's an incredible building. Cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in 19th century dollars to build. It combines stained glass and these incredible enamel mosaics. It has these statues of him on the inside, and it's just it's a perfect mix of almost medieval grandeur and just in the enshrinement of American civic religion. And that's his resting place. That's where he's been buried now, and that's where his members of his family are buried. And not current descendants, but his initial family. A lot of them are in there, and it's just an incredible, grand thing that was raised by a variety of businessmen and former politicians, including Rutherford Hayes after Garfield's death. And then on the bottom, you see something that was built very far away from Garfield's home of Ohio. This is a picture from Bonita Canyon, Arizona. And that is a cairn that was raised by the Buffalo Soldiers, the famous Black Cavalry Regiment. They were deployed to that canyon back in the late 19th century. And you can't see it on here, but each of those stones is inscribed with a different name of one of the soldiers. And it has crossed cavalry sabers stamped into it, broken chain links, all of this incredible symbolism. But the center slab, it has this, it had this little, was facing out towards the desert. It said, "In memory of James A. Garfield." Of all people, this cavalry regiment built something to him. And there has now been scholarship of this, but for a while it was ignored. And because it was ignored, it actually it fell to pieces. It was exposed to the elements. It was taken apart for relics. And as a matter of fact, a spoiler alert, only one of these monuments is still standing, and it's the one on the top. The bottom one doesn't exist anymore. It was taken apart by tourists over time. And then eventually a local, to try to protect it and preserve it in some way, they actually made it into a chimney in their home. So these stones, or at least many of them, are still there. But it was an interesting commentary. And I knew like a year into my writing that was going to be the closing imagery of this book. I didn't know quite what it meant. But I think that there is something in there about this grand monument built by, the white ruling class of that time that stands in Garfield's land. And then this other very humble monument that stands just as far from that as you can really get, that was built by a very different type of Americans and doesn't stand anymore. No one really knows why they dedicated that to James Garfield, but no one thought to ask. And so there's just a lot of symbolism in there, I think, about the way history is written and told. And so that's the closing image. Now, I would shortly like to open it all up to you for questions, but I'll just end on this quote. This is a quote from a very young James Garfield. And this was something he said while he was on his way to Williams College. He passed a fruit stand, didn't know what a banana was, asked the shopkeeper what that fruit was, and the shopkeeper said, like he was an idiot, "It's a banana, you moron." And Garfield walked away, and then he said this to a friend of his who was with him: "I have long since determined not to let an opportunity pass for learning something simply because I must expose my ignorance in so doing." And so I think that's a good quote to encourage any questions you guys might have about this. So thank you so much. This has been great. It's always a pleasure to talk about this subject, and especially to an audience like you. So thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Charlie. It is an amazing story, and it is a story that is appropriate for our time as we talk about divisions and finding paths to common ground. We have several questions, and I'm going to try to, take them as they come. Somebody was saying, trying to follow the conversation. The Buffalo Soldiers Monument was in Arizona, you said.
Yes, it was in Bonita Canyon, Arizona.
And tell us Garfield's role in the Hayes-Tilden election. How did he participate in that particular drama?
Yes, he was he played, as I put in the book, he played the most comprehensive role in the settlement of that constitutional crisis. So for a bit of background, just to cover the basics, ahead of the election of 1876, Democrats who were supporting Samuel Tilden for the presidency had throughout the South participated in a variety of, let's just generously call them, civil rights violations, murdering, intimidating Black voters throughout the region. And in the aftermath of Election Day, it looked briefly like Tilden had decisively won the presidency. But Republicans got hooked on these reports of election irregularities in the South and used that as an excuse to flip 3 Southern states, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, back to Hayes, which would still give Tilden a popular vote majority, but it would allow Hayes to win the presidency by 1 electoral college vote, the thinnest constitutionally possible margin. And so that was the first election where the losing side claimed fraud and threatened civil war. And so for a while, it looked as though a second civil war was likely. James Garfield was heavily involved in all of the deal making that helped settle that controversy. He went down to my home state of Louisiana. He went to my hometown of New Orleans to investigate reports of violence against Black voters. And he said some terrible things about Louisianians. He said, I'll just say this. He said, "It is a shame they are not so pretty as their trees and flowers," which I didn't take personally. But then he went back to the Capitol, and Garfield, as the minority leader of the House, he was in charge of fighting against the Democratic majority that was threatening treason and trying to undermine the certification process. So he was involved in trying to face, this wave of Democratic anger and constitutional chicanery. He was then called behind the scenes to the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission was the special body consisting of 5 Supreme Court justices, 5 representatives, 5 senators, who were then going to vote on essentially which candidate won which state. And by a margin of 8-7, Garfield included, the Republicans, the 8 Republicans outvoted the 7 Democrats, thereby giving the presidency to Hayes. And then, as that was going on, behind the scenes, there were these makings of a deal that were informally being discussed in very controversial, still historically controversial terms, that some Republicans were saying if the Democrats allowed Hayes to assume the presidency peacefully, then the Republicans would end what was left of federal enforcement of civil rights in the South. So the end of Reconstruction. Garfield was invited to the hotel room where all of those terms were being discussed. And upon discovering what conspiracy he had been invited to join, he then very publicly said, "I'm out." And he went home and he wrote about it in his diary, which is one of the key reasons we know that meeting happened at all, actually. So Garfield was there, and he was a phenomenal writer, I got to tell you. He was 2 things that were fantastic from a historical perspective, especially for those moments. He was a prolific writer and a very good one. He was also a hoarder. He hung on to everything. It's almost as if he had a sense that people like you or I would in later years be judging what he did. So he made very sure to record everything he saw and to ensure the record at least somewhat reflected well on him.
Fascinating. Now, I want to tell you about our audience. So Judge C. Ellen Connolly from Cleveland, Ohio, gives us the update on what's actually going on at Lakeview Cemetery now.
Oh, wow.
And she wanted to clarify that only Garfield and his wife are actually entombed there. The ashes of his daughter and her husband, who was Garfield's aide, are next to the casket. And the casket is the only exposed casket of any president.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
And his mom had been entombed there, but she was later moved to be buried next to her husband.
Oh, gosh. Wow.
So now
Interesting.
Learn something new from Judge Conley.
That is, I didn't realize that Eliza had been moved. That's fascinating. So there you go. Wow, you learn something new every day.
I just want to, reveal to you. Now, this assassin, there's been conversation that the assassin was a disappointed office seeker. Is this somebody who was looking for a job and didn't get it? What do we know about the assassin?
Yeah, we probably know too much, unfortunately, I'd argue. So when we say disappointed office seeker, he was one of these very, very many public servants who would use changes in administration, changes in power in Washington, to try to lobby people who had influence to give them a sinecure, a patronage job somewhere in the government. Back then, today we think of civil servants as being very strictly regulated. You have these formalized bureaucracies and these formalized codes of conduct. For much of early American history, there was very little regulation around who actually staffed our government, and actually control of those roles was traditionally given to local congressmen and senators and the secretaries and the president and the vice president themselves. So this assassin was somebody who joined this rush to try to get a job of influence in the administration. Now, he was also deeply mentally ill, and his entire life really had been a story in failure from one field to another. So he had no claim to any of these roles. He wanted to be made ambassador to Paris or Vienna, he said. He imagined that he had been somebody who had been very helpful to Garfield during the election, but he actually had not been. He'd just been giving speeches, on street corners and things like that. So he was a mix of mentally ill and politically activated. The rhetoric that the stalwarts threw out during their fight with Garfield, it had this, it was very toxic, very venomous. And that was an exciting factor in the assassin's planning. And so it led him to conclude that if he got rid of Garfield, then the stalwarts would come to power and they would be grateful to the assassin, and therefore they would give the assassin what he wanted, an ambassadorship. So he was a disturbed individual. And very interestingly, his decision to shoot Garfield, it ended up being the end of the stalwart movement. If you look this up today, you will find that the end of the stalwart Republicans was when this man decided to shoot Garfield on their behalf, because the American public blamed the stalwarts not for being involved in the assassination, because they weren't, at least not directly, but for what their rhetoric had inspired a member of the public to do. And that was very interesting to me. That was a very interesting, I'd argue, contrast with what many of us would expect these days, for the public to, see rhetoric as enough of a inculpating factor in these tragedies. I tried, by the way, the publisher, I tried to not name the assassin at all, because after he did this, the public was fascinated with him. The media attention on him was just absurd, and he loved it. He basked in the attention that he got. And so I actually didn't want to name him whatsoever. But the publisher said, you got to name him at least once. And so I do. But it's in the it's the last time I mention him. It's the one time I talk about him by name.
But it is fascinating that the public at that time held the rhetoric responsible,
yes,
for his action.
Mm-hmm.
There's perhaps a lesson learned. We've got a handful of questions about Garfield's role as a Civil War commander, and let me put them together so you can talk a little bit about that. Did he ever have command over Black troops? How did he deal with the slaves who had, runaway enslaved people who came to the army, and General Butler had said, you can just consider slaves contraband, that they're property, and that was not the same way that Garfield perceived things. How did all that sort out?
Yes, he was never in command of Black troops. Some people claim that he was, but there's no record of that, unfortunately. Garfield was so when you have the orders of General Butler and also General Fremont freeing slaves under categorizing them as property, that was something that happened in other theaters and at a later time than when Garfield was campaigning through the South. So he was still active in fields where that type of confiscation policy, as it was called, was not quite active. So he was present at a lot of, I gotta say, some pretty awful battles. He was there at Shiloh. He was also there at the Battle of Chickamauga. But when it came to executing on his ideals, on that abolitionist fervent feeling that he had, he did the best that he could. So, for example, he would actually speak of himself later in Congress as being the first general to hide runaway slaves in his camp against orders. So he would find ways of trying to undermine the way his section of the Union Army was being run at that time, at least when it came to abolitionist policy. Also later, when he was the chief of staff to General William Rosecrans during the Chickamauga campaign, Garfield was encouraging General Rosecrans to consider allowing local Black citizens to join the force and then take guard duty around Union camps. So he did the best that he could, but it was a severe point of frustration for him, what little that he could do. And he wrote about that pretty extensively back home.
Let's talk about his family. We've got some questions, particularly about his wife and what was the role that she played in molding his legacy and how their relationship matured over time.
Yeah, so James Garfield's wife was Lucretia Rudolph Garfield, and I would best summarize their relationship as being, at one point, it was probably the worst marriage that a president has ever had with their spouse, or at least in competition for that role. And then later on, it was actually, I'd argue, one of the best. So they met each other when they were both very young. They went to the same school in rural Ohio before Garfield went off to Williams College. And right from the beginning, you can sense why they were attracted to each other, and then why Garfield was a little bit hesitant about the relationship. He wrote of Lucretia Crete, as he called her. He said she had this vast intellect. She did. She was at least his equal in terms of intellectual capability, I'd argue. But and this is also something that he wrote. But I doubt that she has that warmth of feeling that I need to make myself happy. So you see that as a young man, he needed that affirmation. He needed that warmth that he didn't perceive in her. And he had these doubts, basically. He loved her mind, but she wasn't as affectionate as he wanted her to be. And it led to him perceiving this distance between them that really lasted for the first few years of their relationship and then their marriage. When he eventually did marry Crete, he actually wrote in his diary, he didn't write, "I married Lucretia Rudolph." He wrote, "I was married to Lucretia Rudolph by so-and-so pastor." So it was passive. It was a passive thing for him by that point. And that showed, because in their first few years of marriage, they barely saw one another, even though they had a child. And the low point of their relationship actually was when James Garfield, as a general in wartime Washington, he had an affair with this reporter from New York. And so that was by far the low point. And it really, in another time, I'd argue, would have been the end of the relationship, except the standards of the era, and then this deeper love that James and Crete had for one another. It ends up being the turning point in their relationship. And so you fast forward 10 years from that affair of his, and James Garfield and Lucretia Garfield have this wonderful growing family. And they're famously a very happy couple in Washington. And people would ask him, actually, journalists repeatedly asked him for his secret. And James Garfield would say the same thing. he would say, I have been wonderfully blessed in the disposition of my wife. She is unstampedable. And that phrase, unstampedable, is, let's just say, a loaded term, because it implies reason to stampede. But she was an incredible woman. Her writings are, she was an adept political commentator. She read widely, arguably more widely than him. And there are these letters that she would write him from their farm in Menor, Ohio, where she would talk about there are these workmen who were doing improvements around the property, and Lucretia would give them ideas and they would ignore her, and then she would turn out to be right. And she would write to her husband, she would say, men have no consideration for the ideas and genius of women, especially men of no culture. But she would also write with great frustration about being a woman in those times. She wrote of the tragedy of women in that period being half civilized, having that intellectual capability of being caught in the barbarianism of household duties. It's equal parts tragic, and really her resilience was inspiring, but the fact that she was trapped in that setting, very tragic. And of course, she's the reason that their farm is now a National Historic Site. She dedicated the rest of her life to preserving his legacy, and she did a phenomenal job. So I think there's a biography of her that is waiting to be written.
Well, Charlie, we are to the end of our allotted time. We still have a bunch of people asking questions, and we've had our previous conversation that you're willing to do 10 bonus minutes at the end.
Yes.
But we want to thank everybody who's with us. And we acknowledge that, for a lot of you, you do this during your lunchtime and you got to be back on your way. And we thank you so much for being with us. Again, we remind you that these are only available because of the contributions that you make. So please make your contributions, become members, share this with others. Several people have asked, is this recorded? Yes, it's recorded. And yes, it will be available on our YouTube channel, and make sure that you have folks share that. We have another webinar coming up next week on Tuesday, and that will be a focus on our ongoing series about the constitutional amendments. This is a series where we're looking at the amendments at the time they were passed, what was going on that made people want to amend the Constitution, and how have that amendments been interpreted today. This is the 15th Amendment, and what is the enduring impact on voting rights? Very much a similar product of the time that Charlie talks to. That's Tuesday, December 19th at noon. We hope you'll sign up for that. And so that being said, we now go into bonus time.
Great.
So here's the bonus question. They're a good handful. I myself could talk to you, Charlie, for another hour, but probably not fair. When Garfield became president, he had some things in his mind. You've read his journals, his diaries. What was his plan to try to address the post-Reconstruction side?
Yeah, that's a very good question. He was exhausted of that, and I say that not in a way of he was not angry about the failure of Reconstruction. He was disappointed, and he was intellectually exhausted that something that he had believed in so firmly had demonstrably not worked. And the reason it had not worked, the entire books have been written, entire libraries have been written about why Reconstruction didn't work. But Garfield had, by his presidency, he had settled on a new idea, a new solution. He had decided, as he put it, and this is a phrase that I actually put in the very beginning of the book. He had decided that justice and wisdom are the solution of it, or justice and wisdom are the solution of everything. And he had decided that the most sustainable Reconstruction policy that the Union could ever really pursue, actually, of all things, would be universal education. Education had been a transformative force in his own life. And he decided that the same principle should be extended to all kinds of Americans, and that would actually be the real solution to addressing systemic inequality, by equipping, as he put it, the majority race in parts of the South, aka Black Americans, with the same training and knowledge that was available to the privileged minority, the white wealthy Americans in parts of the South. So in his inaugural address, he endorses for the first time a president's ever endorsed it in an inaugural address, universal public education as being the next almost panacea for the problems of the Solid South, as it was called in that time. Now, he never really got a chance to implement that, and he also made promises in his inaugural address that he would enforce violations of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Again, unclear whether he really had the ability to do so by that point. But he definitely was latching on to new ideas. And as a matter of fact, his foundation of the first federal Department of Education, he meant that as a Reconstruction measure. He wrote, these are his words, actually, he said this. He said, are we to expand the bounds of citizenship and make no provision to increase the intelligence of the citizen? So he's contrasting not only the emancipation of Black Americans from slavery in the South, but also the arrival in the Northeast of European immigrants. He's seeing the Republic change its definition of what it means to be an American. And he's asking Congress, are we going to make no appropriation to equip all these Americans with the knowledge they need to be successful in this nation? So he had great foresight on a variety of issues, and that was one of them, I'd say.
And what about Native Americans and women?
Yes, that's a very good question. So with Native Americans, his legacy is, let's just say it's stained. James Garfield had what measured at the time to be a relatively open-minded view of Native Americans. He believed from a very young age that, even during his school years, he believed that Native Americans were just as intellectually, morally, socially capable as white Americans. And he continued that view throughout the rest of his life. However, as he got into Congress, he bought into the idea that in order to ensure that those people are able to achieve that equality, they must be removed from their culture. They must integrate into, for lack of a better term, white society. And Garfield actually got a chance to implement this. He was a key figure in the relocation of the Salish tribe of Native Americans of Western Montana. He is appointed as a representative of Ulysses Grant to negotiate the departure of the Salish from a place called the Bitterroot Valley in Western Montana to make room for white settlers. He negotiates with a trio of chieftains, and he ends up one of those chieftains ends up resisting, deciding not to sign the new document. Garfield writes instructions back to DC saying, proceed as if we have the agreement of all three chiefs. So, the horde of white settlers come in, and that's really tragically the beginning of the end of the Salish in the Bitterroot. But Garfield justified that decision. And these are his words again, because he felt that the chiefs were making a great mistake by resisting. So he had this progressive mindset that ended up still being genocidal. And the lack of respect that he showed these people really is telling. And as a matter of fact, I'd encourage everybody out there to read up on the Salish people of Montana. They have great resources on this, and there's a lot of work they're doing right now to tell the story far more effectively than I've just given it to you. As for women, James Garfield was not a convert to women's suffrage. So that was a shortcoming of his. And as a matter of fact, when he was the Republican nominee, he was at his home in Ohio. Susan B. Anthony, he had a few pieces of correspondence with her on the issue. And it was something that he and Creed talked about very often. But he wasn't as open-minded on that issue either, as we'd like to see today.
So we have two more quick questions about other historical figures who were operating at that time. What was Garfield's relationship with Robert Todd Lincoln?
It was interesting. So Robert Todd Lincoln, of all people, was Garfield's pick for Secretary of War. Robert Todd Lincoln served in the Garfield administration. And Robert Todd Lincoln would be the first person to tell you that he did not deserve that job. He had been involved in small town politics, and he had been an attorney, by that point. But his name carried very big panache in the Republican Party of that time, and because of that name, he had significance, and so, especially for somebody like Garfield, who was trying to project Republican unity. So he had Robert Todd Lincoln come as a Secretary of War, and apparently he did a decent job. But tragically, Robert Todd Lincoln was one of the witnesses to Garfield's shooting. He was in the train station waiting for an audience with President Garfield, and he saw it happen. He saw it happening about 40 feet away, apparently. And he, as Secretary of War, was in charge of securing the scene by summoning policemen and soldiers to secure the site. And then he left, and he was walking outside, and he said to a journalist, "How many hours of suffering have I seen in this town?" Which shows you there was a lot of tragedy around Robert Lincoln as a character, Robert Todd Lincoln.
Amazing. Before we get to our last question, there's a couple just folks who wrote in to send their greetings. Ken Ackerman, the author of Dark Horse,
of course,
is on, and he says, "Welcome to the club."
Tell him I really appreciate, I'll tell you what Ken's probably right here. Dark Horse and The Gold Ring were both very, very helpful. For your books are fantastic.
So he's hoping one day he gets to meet you.
I love that.
And then we've got a listener who's in Canfield, Ohio, who has enjoyed the presentation, and his family goes back to a log cabin that allowed him to join the Sons of the American Revolution.
Oh, wow.
And he really wants to applaud you for capturing the spirit of the Western Reserve.
Great. Glad to hear it.
We will assure you, we will send information about how to get the book. He's asking, how can you get the book? And one final question, and that is Thaddeus Stevens, another radical Republican of the time, older, transition. What was the relationship between Thaddeus Stevens and Garfield?
Not good. Thaddeus Stevens was not only the leader of the radical Republicans, in so much as that movement had a leader in the House, he was also the oldest representative. He was ancient, and he was very notoriously sardonic, sarcastic, cruel, witty. And Garfield was another radical who was who other Garfield biographers have described Garfield as the youngest representative. Technically, again, not true. But he and Stevens really fought very often. And they fought because Stevens was somebody who was trying very much to keep the radicals coherent behind floor action and legislative policy. And Garfield was too much of an independent thinker, too much of a young iconoclast who was breaking off and trying to dispute and pick hairs with the radical position in ways that were not constructive to any of the issues at hand, let's say. And actually, Garfield wrote, I believe, he explained his fighting with Stevens to a friend. He said, old Thad can't lead the radicals around by the nose like he's used to. So he's basically boasting about causing trouble for this old cantankerous leader. But Stevens is also just another fantastic figure of that time. So many colorful personalities.
Which is the nature of a legislative body.
Mm.
Charlie, thank you for your time. I know we could keep going, but I'd encourage everybody to read the book. It is 100% worth it. I did it, and it is really captures it all. So thank you so much. We thank you again for being part of this. We look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. If we don't see you, have a wonderful holiday season and a good new year. And we will continue our study of history and what does it mean for today. Thank you and congratulations on your book.
Oh, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.